back. We're live. I'm Jay Fidell. This is ThinkTech. We're catching up on Kakaako. What should we build in Kakaako Makai? Our 40-story luxury condos, the answer. We're going to talk to DeSoto Brown, who is, what can I say? He's a man of great aesthetics, of great vision around the city and county and the state. Okay, DeSoto, you know the story. You know, there's controversy and contention in the state legislature because OHA wants to get permission to build a 40-story condo there at the point of land on the Ewa shoreline of Kakaako Makai. A lot of people feel it's a bad idea. And from your point of view, from the aesthetics point of view, the architecture point of view, you're a co-host on your main architecture on our series. I'd like to know your thoughts about it because this is still in play. Some people say it'll never pass the legislature because it's not rational. But I want to know your thoughts.
Jay, you and I have discussed this a little bit in the past, but the first thing I want to get to before I discuss aesthetics or anything else like that about city planning or the presence of the city, Kakaako Makai is problematic for development for two reasons. One, it is all landfill. So that's not natural land that just formed through natural processes. Human beings have pushed the land out and filled it in. The problem with that is that when humans do that, you end up with unstable land in a variety of ways because it's composed of all this different stuff that's never compacted or formed in natural ways. Second, that area is susceptible to inundation. And that means that, first of all, if there's a tsunami, that area could be affected by a tsunami. And secondly, and this is true of our entire South Shore, and this is a bigger problem than just this, what we can talk about in this particular moment, if and when a major hurricane impacts Oahu directly from the south, and twice we have missed those impacts in the 80s and 90s when the hurricane shifted to Kauai. Kauai's disaster was our good luck. But when that happens, because it could, probably will, the storm surge will inundate that area as well. And that is potentially catastrophic. And not just for there, as I said, that affects Honolulu Harbor, it affects Waikiki, it affects it affects Honolulu Airport, all of that. But anything that's built in that area, you've got to be cognizant of that reality. Now, I mentioned to you just before the show that the city of Hilo has been catastrophically damaged by tsunamis twice, in 1946 and 1960. And after the 1960s disaster, which wiped out a great deal of downtown, any buildings that were left in the inundation zone or were built in the inundation zone had to be built to accommodate the potential of being catastrophically flooded on the first and second floor, if perhaps. So that means that the buildings can not only withstand the tsunami, but also it means that everything that's on the ground floor is essentially disposable. Because if that is washed through by the ocean, you can recover. Now, a lot of buildings today, and in Waikiki, this is a problem, particularly as the ocean levels begin to rise, we're going to see water coming up through the ground. The water table is going to rise underground. But it also means that if there is inundation, anything that's below grade, anything that's dug out into the earth, and many Waikiki high-rises have sub-level parking, that's also where they put a lot of their machinery. So, for example, that's where their machinery to run the elevators is located. Well, if that gets flooded and you got to pump it out, you're not going to have functional elevators for a good long time. And if we're talking about 40-story buildings, those upper stories are unlivable because there's no electricity, there's no way for people to get water, there's no air conditioning, and you can't keep your food in a refrigerator that doesn't work. But most importantly, if you're stuck up there and you're older and infirm, you can't get back down to the ground or get back up. So these are all, I'm just throwing this out as these are considerations that anything that's getting built in that area needs to take into account. Now, I also mentioned to you a while back that in the 1990s, it was proposed by somebody in the state government that as that area was beginning to be developed and as the John Burns Medical School, UH Medical School was being built down there, somebody said, hey, Bishop Museum, why don't you think about constructing a whole new complex in this new developed area? I was not involved in any of that discussion, and obviously it didn't go anywhere. But at the time, I said to anybody who would listen, there is no way Bishop Museum, with all of its priceless artifacts, is going to be located in an inundation zone of either tsunami or a hurricane storm surge. So apart from, again, any of the other considerations we might talk about during this particular time right now, that's really, really important. And as you said, people frequently don't even consider these things. They think they can buy a solution. If the ocean level rises or when there's a storm or some other natural disaster, you can't buy your way out of that. We have to live with the realities of the physical world we're in. And that's one of the big realities. So before anybody starts building 40-story buildings, stop and talk to somebody who knows about what the realities of that physical location are.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's an interesting concept. Well, one guy I talked to said, developers, they always run into troubles of one kind or another, and they always find some engineer that will help them out of it, and they always solve these problems. But I think what I get here is that there are some problems that we are not able to solve at any price.
That's absolutely true. And I mean, we've just seen this unparalleled disaster of the earthquake in Turkey, in which at this point it's over 40,000 people have been killed. And primarily it's through collapses of multi-story buildings that simply fell completely flat on themselves. And you remember the Surfside condominium that fell down in Florida. And that was news for weeks. And that was a huge story. Well, imagine that happened 7,000 times. And that's what happened in Turkey. So my point is, you can build buildings that will deal with these things, but you cannot always engineer yourself or pay your way out of something the physical world is throwing at you. You got to deal with that. And I think, well, anyway, let's just keep discussing. I mean, there are a lot of other aspects of this.
Well, one of the issues that's come up is the Red Hill. I call it the Red Hill issue. Why? Because the aquifer is down there. The aquifer that provides fresh water for us to drink, it's right down there. And if you want to at least take an attempt at making a stable 40-story building, you have to use pilings at the least. And the pilings have to go way down, 40, 50 feet. Who knows how many? Nobody knows exactly how far down it is. But it's a fair chance that the pilings will penetrate the soil, the landfill, any membrane that's there, and will ultimately penetrate the aquifer. And when you have a landfill with toxic materials and a piling that penetrates the landfill and goes down into the aquifer, you have the Red Hill effect, don't you?
Well, this is a very good point, because I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows what's underground there. That was an industrial area, and it was a dump for decades. The incinerator was nearby, and this is where Honolulu dumped its trash for decades before that area began to get cleaned up. And I can also mention that Ala Moana Park, a short distance away, was also a dump where everything was dumped. And of course, this is in a time period where there were no regulations on what you dumped where, and things were burned for decades. So we don't even know what's underground in that Kakaako area. We don't know what was dumped there. And this is, again, the Honolulu Iron Works was not that far away either. So all kinds of potential toxic stuff is under there. And yes, you're absolutely right. And the other point about the aquifer, which is very important, is as the ocean level rises and salt water seeps in and it goes up, the fresh water on top of it gets pushed up as well. So not only are we talking about our drinking water, we're talking about water coming up essentially through the floor. You can build to accommodate that. I mean, there are a number of high rises in Honolulu in which they had to constantly keep pumping as they were pouring in the concrete because water wanted to come in. So it's possible to do it. It just is a major consideration. Personally, as I said before, knowing the potential for weeks worth of lost electricity due to a hurricane storm surge, I don't want to live on the 40th floor of a building where I know I will be at very least pushed out of my building, I'll have to walk down 40 stories and go live somewhere else before they can restore the utilities to it if it's damaged. So I'm leery of it personally. A lot of other people are, oh no, that'll never happen. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm not one of those people. I'm concerned, and I know the possibilities exist.
Michael Kimmelman is the New York Times architecture reviewer, and he teaches a course of that nature in Yale as well. And he talks about quality of life in a given city. Cities are really important in that they offer spaces, public spaces. And I really take his point for Honolulu, because we have not been faithful to public spaces. There are not many public spaces, and they are being gobbled up by development. I went for dinner in Kakaako Makai yesterday, and there are all these construction sites, and every one of them has another 40-story condominium building. And the only place left that I can think of with any dimensions of open space, of public space, is this very Kakaako Makai. So I'd like to know your thoughts about the urban development of our city, the quality of life that our city has provided and would provide, either with or without these condominiums.
Okay, well, you bring up a really good point, and I have two things that I want to say about that. In the first place, in along with what I just mentioned about areas that are threatened by natural forces, the best thing you can do in areas like that is to leave them open as parkland. That's what happened to the city of Hilo. After their downtown was decimated, they simply said, we got to get out of the way of the ocean. They pulled everything back. They condemned all the private property, and they turned this into an expansive parkland. So right on the waterfront of Hilo is this huge park. And not only is that the area that the tsunami can flow into without destroying anything, it's also turned into the location where floodwaters are accumulated. And there are big floods in Hilo. And the floods go into this area, they submerge it all to several feet deep, and nothing gets damaged because it's just grass and trees. So you use it as parkland, but you also are aware of its capacity to deal with what nature throws at it. First of all. Second of all, what you just mentioned about multiple 40-story buildings is very true. And one of the problems with multiple self-contained huge structures is that, as a rule, they all occupy a large footprint, and the bottom part is a plinth, which is normally parking. You may have some retail, but basically it's parking for cars, and then there's this freestanding structure. The problem with that is you have no street life. You have nothing to walk around and occupy yourself while you walk. A lower level of urbanization, like downtown Honolulu, means that every step of your way, there's something to occupy you, to look at, to go into, to eat at, or to buy something at, or just look at. When you've got these multiple freestanding monoliths, there's nothing for the pedestrian to do except walk past featureless fronts that may have one or two restaurants and nothing else.
Well,
So
a lot of the ones in Kakaako right now, they have 50-foot or more escarpments and concrete. It's really it's a lousy experience to walk under that.
Absolutely. That's my point. That's my point. So every one of these freestanding things doesn't do anything for the person on the ground. It does something for the person who lives in his or her little cubicle within it. But that's just a cut-off existence where there is no urbanity, there's no street life, there's nothing to occupy you. And that is one of the things that you can see in other cities, including Honolulu, where as a pedestrian, there are attractions or things to enhance your existence. And when you've got all those separate buildings far apart from each other, they don't have that. Waikiki, Kalakaua Avenue does have that. And that is one of its major attractions. And I can say, in comparison to, for example, Ka'anapali on Maui, Ka'anapali is a resort development that was supposed to be kind of the anti-Waikiki when it was put together in 1960, in which there was a lot of open space and a lot of freestanding buildings. And so, in a sense, it didn't become a dense city the way Waikiki did. But as a pedestrian, Ka'anapali has nothing to offer you. You get in a car and drive from one hotel to another with a big, expansive green area and a lot of open space from a golf course, but nothing for you as a human who's walking around. Waikiki does have that. And that's one of the reasons people go there, even though it is a very densely populated city by itself. In Kakaako, as it is now being developed, and along Kapiolani Boulevard, for example, as well, we don't see that. We don't see anything to make you want to get out of your car and experience it. The development of SALT, to its great credit in Kakaako, is a place where people will go walk around and have a sense of camaraderie and grouping, because humans, most of us humans, are social. We enjoy the hustle and bustle of being with other people. SALT has that. Once you venture out a little bit, there still may be some hints of it. But once you get over into the Howard Hughes area, none of that is there. So I would not want to see the OHA developments become the same type of thing as that, because what's the benefit? What is the overall benefit to the city? There's the benefit for the inhabitants of each individual monolith, but there isn't a benefit for those of us from the outside who want to go there. We don't want to go there if we don't have to.
Yeah, and just a footnote, that is the each individual inhabitant has paid millions for these units, and one of the reasons that person has paid millions is because it costs a lot of money to build them, with all of these environmental issues and problems, and that raises the price and millions, and that you're attracting investors from faraway places. So what you're doing is you're weighing it in favor of that disappearing investor against the local people who really do need open spaces, public spaces, and we're losing our public spaces. But I want to mention one other thing that did not occur to me until yesterday, DeSoto, and you alluded to it. It's this: condos are different than the way housing was built back in the day when you and Martin Despang talk about, the development of the state after statehood, where people knew who their neighbor was and they talked to their neighbor. They went down to the pool, for example, in a circumferential kind of development, and it was a community. It was a community, is my point. But in condos, as they have evolved in Hawaii, especially in these 40-story condos, that's not the case. For security reasons and other reasons, I suppose, people don't want to know who their neighbors are. They don't talk to their neighbors. If you're a politician trying to get votes, you can't walk through that condo. If you're somebody who would like to establish relationships with the people in those units, you can't. They all live in a little tiny silo all of their own. This changes the quality of communal life. And with these 40-story condos sprouting up everywhere, we are losing the quality of communal life. Your thoughts?
Absolutely. I agree with you completely. And I would also add, too, that I think part of the isolation comes from the current day obsession with closing yourself off from the outside air, even. So that these are buildings that don't even have lanais necessarily. They don't have windows that open. They are glass boxes that are air conditioned from within. You are even more cut off from the rest of humanity when that occurs. I would also say, too, that in the older buildings, which are, for example, two-story walk-ups or even older condos from the 1960s, there's a great deal more openness. The hallways are even open to the outside. You are interacting with people more because you're seeing them and hearing them. Again, if it's even a 10-story building and there's a pool and a deck, you're going to be interacting with more people than a 40-story building, people who you're going to see again and again. In a 40-story building, there are quantities of people you'll never see. You may run into them at the pool, but you're not going to form any kind of relationship or friendship with them because you're never going to see them again. So the sheer size of the buildings and the way they are cut off from not only other humans, but the outside world emphasizes your isolation and cuts off your interactions, just as you just said.
OHA argues that this is somehow good for the Native Hawaiian people. That's very questionable. But one of the issues that I would like to talk to you about is affordable housing
Mhm.
for the Native Hawaiian people, for all people. You know, they're not the only ones who need affordable housing. And
That's
in
right.
fact, if you just provided government affordable housing or allowed benefits that would provide government affordable housing to Native Hawaiians, you'd be violating the law.
Yeah.
It can't be determined on a racial basis. In any event, so if you have this property and you develop it, and apparently their plan is to turn it over to a developer, some
Mhm.
really well-heeled developer, who has the financial depth to do anything theoretically, and that developer builds and sells them all out, and then takes off and goes back to whence he came, and sends OHA a check, no matter whether that's big or small, and OHA then has money. But in the process, have we provided affordable housing? Because as I mentioned before, you give a 40-story condo and luxury condo, I might add, that the price of each individual unit, whether it's designated as affordable or not, is going to be way beyond the ability of most people, most local people, especially including Native Hawaiians. So I do not see a path by which this project could ever help our problem in housing. Can you
Yeah.
see a path?
Well, I think what you just said is exactly the situation in terms of OHA has to weigh. It says, on one hand, we need to provide things, intangible things like housing. On the other hand, that requires money. So where do we earn money? Well, we turn this over to a developer, as you said, we earn money, and then we put that money into other things which benefit Hawaiian people. Well, that's a balance that the board of OHA and the elected trustees have to cope with. Unfortunately, I'm not one of them and I don't have to address it. But the other thing to consider in terms of affordable housing, and I think this normally doesn't get brought up very much, and I don't have a solution for it, but if you've got a very expensive condo that everybody's paying money into and every month they're paying a condo fee, in theory, that high condo fee then keeps the building up, keeps the building in good condition. If you have low income housing where people can't pay that, the downside is that you don't have money for maintenance. And once somebody breaks a window or busts a hole in something, or the elevator stopped working or whatever, where do you get the money to upgrade it? Because it's low income, so nobody can pay for it. And if it is government supported, then that's another drain on taxpayer money that people are saying, wait, we've only got this much pie, we can only cut it up this many ways. And Kuhio Park Terrace, which is two high-rise condos essentially for low income, are always in terrible condition because nobody can pay money to do the upkeep. So again, I'm sorry I don't have a solution for this, but that's a huge consideration. Once it starts to go downhill, I'm sure you know the whole theory about one broken window. A window that's not repaired in a building is a visual sign that more windows can be broken and more things can be done to damage it and more vandalism can occur. And once you started that going, then it's very hard to come back from it. If you can't afford to fix that first window, then you could see yourself going on a really severe downhill spiral. So again, the balance of you can't pay for it, but you need the money anyway, and because you can't pay for it because the people in it can't afford it. Uh, you tell me what the solution is because I don't know.
I don't have a solution. What I can see is a huge mistake here, where the local people, Native Hawaiian people, really don't have any benefit whatsoever.
Right,
And there,
right.
there are people trying to negotiate with OHA to give them other land. They can do housing, for example, in Kalihi. They can do housing where the ballpark is, Aloha Stadium and all that. Those are possibilities that have been suggested, but they're determined to do this. And what troubles me, and I'll tell you my very limited experience. When I was in college, I took a course in city planning from a guy who was a retired official of the city of New York. And I learned a lot from him. He took us around to other cities in the area and showed us how it worked in some places, how it didn't work, how it worked for a while and then it didn't work, that sort of thing. And so, the whole thing is to look into the future. what kind of a city would we like to have? Where are we going on this? And, DPP has not done us any favors by permitting these huge buildings. Why do we have to have these huge buildings? When Kakaako was first sold to the public, as a live, work, learn, and play kind of experience, which would be, the kind of city we all wanted, it was sold on a different basis altogether. There were roads that meandered. There were lots of setbacks, bicycle lanes, you name it, and open spaces. And we're miles away from that now. And but the reality is that DPP and other government agencies that might have done a better job on executing a livable city in a way, the center of the livable city in Kakaako. So I wonder
Right.
what your thoughts are. This is not, I guess it includes aesthetic, but it also includes livable cities. It includes what we have hoped for all these years in the post-statehood time in terms of, residential, retail, and other uses, and whether this is meeting that standard, or have we lost our minds?
Yeah, well, okay. And to go back to what I said earlier, I don't necessarily think that all tall buildings are evil, as long as they are set in a place where the human on the ground has something to live for, not just through soulless towers that soar into the sky that as I walk around, am dwarfed by with nothing to get back to me. So that can be done as long as, I mean, New York, there's a ton to walk around in and look at in New York. There's a ton to walk around in and look at in Waikiki, which is a whole bunch of tall. So yes, you can achieve that. I would also say too that there is I think, a benefit to a graduation of heights and sizes. I think rather than a march of identically sized buildings stretching off forever, again, I think sort of sucks your soul out. But it can be different if you've got a variety of things going on. If you have a group of, again, monoliths that are each on its own plinth, widely spaced, you're getting none of that for anybody. So that is something I don't think we should be wanting to go for. I think mixed density, variations in height and mass, and always keeping in mind the street level has got to have space for and accommodation for people on bikes, people on foot, as well as a whole variety of things to see and do. And if that's the case, you can have a lot of big buildings, but they're livable, but life is good. If you've got a bunch of widely spaced tall buildings that have nothing else going on, you're not doing that. And I would also say too, and this is a little bit far afield, but I think it's true. We've got a height limit of 400 feet. And what that means is our skyline is chopped off. Everything comes up to a uniform height, and that's it. We have no visual, again, aesthetic thing to look at that's taller. And the sort of classic downtown that you look at in the United States, mostly, in which there may be a tall building and some other smaller ones around it, gives you, I think, an aesthetic sense of excitement and interest. There's a focal point to look at. We don't have that in Honolulu because we don't have any taller buildings. And there are people who say, well, that's not Hawaiian to have a 60-story building. Well, excuse me, a 40-story building is not Hawaiian either. We're a city. Let's admit that we're a city. We're not a sleepy Polynesian fishing village, and deal with that aesthetically, which again is far afield from our basic point that you and I are discussing right now. But I don't think it's irrelevant. I think that's part of the whole discussion of a livable and or attractive city that you want to go to.
One of the ironic points, we're almost out of time here, DeSoto, but one of the most ironic points that I see is this. Ordinarily, the expertise to review and approve plans for these projects and to develop a comprehensive in the city and county is within DPP. Now, DPP has had troubles, we know. They've had corruption problems and they have competence problems for a long time. However, they're the ones who've been doing it. Okay? Now, all of a sudden, we find HCDA, which is a state government cutout in that area, and not to review all of the machinations that went into why that really happened. the fact is that now all these considerations that you and I are talking about are being handled by the state legislature, which is really, it's very questionable that they have the competence or the, what do you want to call it, the expertise, the experience to deal with these kinds of issues that we're talking about. You know what they say, no man or woman's life or property is safe while the legislature is in session. Well, you could also say that no zoning issue or issue beyond their competence is safe when they're addressing it while they're in session. I almost wish we could go back to DPP and have them, apply their expertise to this and try to make a plan. Your thoughts?
Yeah. And I think one of the problems is, one, we are always in a constant state of flux, so that there's no continuity. So somebody might have a strong plan and it kind of falls and falters and it goes away. Or you always have constant turnover of people in the government and people in various offices, and there isn't a continuity of, that's our vision and we're going to stick to it. And also, buildings are usually developed kind of in a vacuum. In other words, it's just, this is this block, we're going to do this with this block. How this block fits in with the other blocks is not our consideration. We're doing our particular thing, and don't try to tell us I have to take into account all this other stuff because you're standing in the way of me as a developer, and get out of my way because that's government interference. So the problem is, if there is no overarching or larger plan which can be stuck to which addresses the things that you and I just discussed, these individual things will pop up and occur, discrete, separate units, which do not create a livable whole for either a district or the whole city. And that, again, would require more government control than I think a lot of people would be willing to deal with, would accept. So again, I don't have a solution, but I'm just saying that's, I think, what the problem is and what we're talking about. Each thing, again, is a separate, discrete unit, and it doesn't relate necessarily to the others, either in its overall aesthetics or the ground level experience.
There's much more, DeSoto, but we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for this discussion. I found it very helpful. Appreciate
Good,
that.
great. Thanks for having me.
Aloha.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.